Mr. James McNitt, how are we doing today, sir?
I'm very well, Joey. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I'm doing all right. I'm having a good time. I got to know, in the current state of affairs that we're all dealing with, what's the thing you've learned about yourself the most that has maybe been surprising in terms of this isolation?
I've found that escaping from my children in my house is more difficult than I thought it would be. They seem to always know where I am, so I have to get creative. In fact, I've pretended to leave for work in the morning and then snuck
Oh,
back in the house simply so they didn't know I was still here. So that's been,
interesting.
yeah. So that's probably the
Little decoy throwing him off the scent.
it worked pretty well, and three here, I think they're starting to get the gist. So I'm gonna have to get a little bit more creative, find another option.
Well, it's not even that they can't, like, it's not even that you can't escape them sometimes. The challenge is they know exactly the worst time to come and bother you. Like, they just, something goes
Yes,
off in their head, like, man, you know what? He's probably on the phone. I'm just going to go bang on that door and
exactly
make it
right.
be very embarrassing for him. But it's something I think we've all dealt with in some capacity. So we can all at least be a little understanding.
It makes it fun.
Speaking of fun, what's going on with medical professional liability, telemedicine? I mean, things are just going crazy. I have to assume that things in your world are at least interesting right now, more so than they would normally would be.
It's a great question. We are getting quite a bit of phone calls and fielding a lot of emails because, as you might suspect, healthcare is a space that has been completely turned upside down as a result of COVID-19. We are seeing medicine being treated in many different ways. So, if we were to focus specifically on telemedicine, we're seeing that many entities and physicians or other medical practitioners are delivering medicine telemedically where they may not have in the past or aren't trained to do so. From an insurance standpoint, that's kind of scary. We always want to expect that our insureds, our doctors and our entities know what they're doing, and everyone has been, based on state ordinances, tasked with doing their same job but doing it from home. A lot of our insurance carriers don't have language that necessarily addresses telemedicine. And while some people will sell the benefits of silent, quote unquote, silent insurance, a lot of people who have been in this industry for a while know that that's kind of scary, and all it does is potentially give an insurance carrier the ability to decline a claim if it were to come in. So we recommend always checking with your insurance carrier to make sure that they understand that the business now is going from being in person to now being medicine being delivered telemedically. We do have a few insurance carriers who can write standalone telemedicine policies. So it's more important than ever to understand exactly what is being provided uh, from a medicine perspective. And when we write those standalone telemedicine policies, that's coverage only specifically for the telemedical exposure that now exists as a result of our current environment. One other quick item I'll note is that the standalone telemedicine policies include both a tower for professional liability, a tower for cyber, and a tower for technology E&O. That's very important because
Hmm.
a lot of people who have cyber insurance, they assume that that's going to cover them for any issue that were to go on during a telemedicine consult. If technology fails and that leads to bodily injury, cyber won't cover that, but we write policies that have a bodily injury claims trigger. So if technology is the reason for bodily injury to occur, we would have coverage for that.
So I'm kind of curious, like, what was I guess the industry stance or even just general agents' awareness of telemedicine kind of before all this? Was it something that was just like an afterthought, like maybe checkbox, or was just sort of this throwaway line item in a policy versus now it's becoming such a main event headliner? Um, what do you think agents need to be aware of now, just kind of moving forward in the clients that they have in terms of what's available versus how they just need to be looking at this coverage moving forward? Is it going to be more standalone policies? Is it going to be enhanced, lines of coverage on a more traditional policy? What are we dealing with?
Sure, great question. So we are seeing carriers paying more attention to it than they were in the past. It's over the past couple of years, it's been getting more popular. It's a way for a physician to go from seeing, call it 8 to 10 patients a day to maybe 80 to 100 because they're much quicker consults. Obviously, if there's a way to make money doing that, we're going to see many people driving towards that area. A lot of insurance companies are changing the way their policy language is worded, and taking a little bit of that ambiguity out and making sure that there's either exclusion or affirmative coverage specifically for telemedicine. And that's going to be something that I think as a result of the COVID-19 virus that we're going to see more specific policy language going forward. One other item, and I want to make it clear that as we record this phone call, it may be outdated by the time we're done because of how fluid the situation is, but we're seeing certain immunities and leniency by certain states for any medical professional who's treating a patient as a result of COVID-19. That's being put in place, obviously, as we are in a situation here on April 2nd. It's more critical than ever. They're all hands on deck from a healthcare practitioner standpoint. So states are putting in immunities for those that are rushing or running towards a fire, as an old insurance saying. That's a good thing. However, every state department of insurance dictates what is and what is not covered. And while our federal government and state governments are taking stances, they're not doing it necessarily to align with what the insurance companies are stating. So we're in this crazy time of flux where I am nearly certain we have some plaintiff attorneys that are reading through policy language and through these new state laws and state bills to find a way to bring a lawsuit against a medical practitioner, even if they were trying to treat somebody with COVID-19. I hope that's not the case, and we all believe in humanity trying to get through this together, but it's would not surprise me if we saw some lawsuits come out of when it's all said and done.
Well, first of all, James, I mean, how dare you not be able to predict the future? That's pretty pretty ridiculous on your part. A little disappointed, not sure what we're going to do now. Second of all, I would hope that there is, like you said, some leniency in terms of, understanding the situations and listen, nobody really expected this. We're all trying to do our best to keep everybody as safe as possible. Outside of toilet paper being an issue, I mean, we have seemed to, at least for the most part, have fared fairly well, I guess, in terms of the being nice to each other. It seems like everybody's kind of come to this realization. Now, I'm kind of curious in terms of, again, telemedicine has been around for a while, right? And I used to sell health insurance once upon a time and was big on the telemedicine thing. And it's something that it feels like we're being forced into this versus, we've always had this technology. What do you think benefits are going to come from this, maybe, if any, since we are being force-fed a little more necessity to kind of adopt this? Is there any sort of upside to this in terms of realizing that we might be able to be more efficient with things or do things a little bit differently now?
I think a lot of people who previously didn't have a comfort level around telemedicine because either they hadn't tried it or they just didn't feel the need to look into it. Change is hard for some people, and they have been so used to going and waiting in the doctor's office for hours before being called for their time slot. I think we're going to see a tremendous uptick in that comfort level being expanded, and people will find out that telemedicine does have an extreme value. Obviously, there's only so much you can do with a telemedical consult, but it's not just for your primary care practitioner. It can be mental health consults, psychiatrists, psychologists. It can go a lot further than just checking height and weight over the phone. So we do see that it's going to be a growing space. Now, a lot of employers are looking into it as well. A lot of Fortune 500 companies have been looking into it because it is a less expensive way to treat a larger population base. So I think there's a lot of opportunities that will come out of this from a physician standpoint, helping them create a new patient base, generate a larger patient base, because from their own marketing aspects, they no longer have to be sitting behind a desk in an office seeing, again, 8 to 10 patients a day. They can drastically increase the amount of patients they're seeing.
And if we're thinking from the agent's perspective out there, in terms of let's say they have clients that have maybe been treating through telemedicine. One of the big things is the state lines thing, right? That's one of the things that I think trips up a lot of people, much like insurance agents with their licenses, right? You want to sell insurance to everybody that comes to your door, but ultimately you got to make sure you're licensed to do so. What do you think agents should be looking out for in terms of going into this next kind of renewal cycle in terms of telemedicine, or just the general medical professional liability that they have been quoting forever? What are some of the things, if you had to break down some really key points to kind of double check moving forward now?
So we've seen that there is, back to one of my prior comments, leniency being delivered to a lot of these medical professionals, whereas they no longer have to be licensed in the state where the patient is located. So from a telemedicine perspective, the state where the patient is located is where a doctor has to have their license. Now that's being that's being put on hold during this COVID-19 situation, so long as you are treating patients for COVID-19 when traveling across state lines. The current leniency, and I use that word intentionally because it's, in my opinion, not necessarily guaranteed, but there's a leniency around having licenses in other states, and they're being more lenient on the HIPAA laws as well, so that claims cannot be brought against these medical practitioners for any sort of HIPAA claims that could come forward. Simultaneous to what I said earlier, insurance carriers are aware of these things, and it's up to them whether or not to agree to a certain point. At the end of every one of these bills, including the one that Andrew Cuomo drafted yesterday, there is a specific line item that states that there is immunity for these medical practitioners so long as they do not commit gross negligence. This is not an insurance contract, so there is not a definition section afterwards. So gross negligence is up to the eye of the beholder. And while we all can picture what that could mean in a medical professional situation, I think that anytime there is ambiguity in a contract, that it is very dangerous for somebody to assume.
That's a good tip for sure. And like you said, we want to think that the best would kind of happen in all of the situation. But in terms of that leniency, I think the other thing that you mentioned on it was the HIPAA, right? Because that's an area that people are racing to use different platforms that they might not be familiar with. Again, mistakes might be made. Some information might get out. How big of an issue do you think that could be potentially? Is that another one of those leniencies where there isn't any a 6-page kind of detailed explanation as to what we're dealing with HIPAA and the technologies?
I think that is been one of the strongest bills that's put out thus far because it's been done on a federal basis. My expectation is that there isn't going to be that many errors from a HIPAA standpoint. There are certain video conferencing platforms that are HIPAA compliant. So Zoom Technologies, for example, is technically a video conferencing platform that's HIPAA compliant, although obviously in the past 24 hours they've had some issues with all sorts of hacking. So while they are HIPAA compliant, and we have insurance carriers who will state, we are okay with you doing telemedicine so long as your provider is HIPAA compliant. As long as everyone's playing by the rules, then coverage should be afforded. But I worry that where that leniency could see some gray area is if somebody is doing a FaceTime, for example, or a otherwise non-HIPAA compliant, Snapchat and all these other social mediums that I'm not very familiar with. If they're using those and it's recording the conversation, for example, and that accidentally gets onto the internet, that's the type of thing where it might not be intentional, but the lack of technological expertise could lead to some errors.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, no kind of like pretend to be one, but that's borderline gross negligence. I imagine like if you're kind of reckless in the technology that you're, adopting, I would imagine like it's common sense, but who knows? I'm also curious in terms of, where would you maybe see some opportunity? That's a strong word to use during this time period. But again, agents, everybody is trying to normalize their business in some way, shape, or form in terms of how are we going to, kind of get by. And as they're looking at this, if there's somebody that has focused on this coverage in the past and they're saying, well, who am I looking for now? Like, what does a good prospect look like in terms of, who's going to need this coverage or this kind of advice, this counseling from an agent moving forward? Maybe that wasn't as good of a target before.
I think it's more important than ever to have expertise in this space. Obviously, RPS Healthcare has that. We are going to see more and more laws being delivered in the next several weeks as we continue down this path that we're on. And I think it's only going to get more and more convoluted. Having that expertise and having the market relationships that we have with underwriters who it's their responsibility to stay on the cutting edge of this. Ultimately, they're the ones binding contracts that are stating whether or not something is covered. It's very critical to be working with those that are as up to speed as possible. Everyone's going to need this. There is not a healthcare entity today that is not facing these challenges. Again, from a healthcare standpoint, we have a lot of essential or what's been deemed as essential healthcare operations that are still open, but anything with an elective surgery, any dentists, any physical therapy clinics, et cetera, those are all closed down. And because they don't have a storefront doesn't mean that they're not trying to still keep their doors open, and they're obviously still trying to see their patients in one way, shape, or form. keeping the education level of our buyers as high as possible is more critical than ever. And that's understanding the latest in the laws for each state that they're operating in, updating them on what the client's rights are. Because if a client is able to bring a lawsuit for a certain thing, certain telemedical visit that they weren't able to in the past based on a new bill, it's important that we keep everyone updated with that.
All right, James, one more question for you. And if you kind of had to look to say, I'm going to leave agents with one piece of advice, like during this whole thing, we talked a lot about what's happening, what could happen. If you had to say, like, listen, if you did one thing, again, they're going to do more than one thing. But if you had to say, like, this is the most important thing that, you're going to want to at least start with, what's that starting point for you in terms of agents and kind of, navigating their clients and even just the medical providers themselves, just kind of dealing with this whole thing?
We see quite a bit of loyalty in this space between a doctor and a patient. And I think it's more important than ever that if a doctor is looking at this situation as an opportunity to jump into telemedicine with 2 feet for the first time, or try to expand their current practices because they think they can make more money and be opportunistic in this time. We have seen a tremendous amount of data around a current doctor-patient relationship avoiding claims. So an example of that is that a patient who has a relationship with a doctor is less likely to sue them because they understand that the doctor is just another person who has studied medicine, and they're doing the best they can in this situation that is extremely fluid for all of us. So, for example, we insure some physical therapy clinics where a patient has been going into the physical therapy office for years as part of a recovery for surgery, and now they're doing the same physical therapy, stretching, and advisory via telemedicine. If for some odd reason there were to be a situation that resulted in bodily injury during that telemedical physical therapy visit, and the patient who is ultimately injured knows that physical therapist and knows it was, they probably won't bring a lawsuit against them. If it's that relationship isn't there and it's clear that the medical professional didn't know what they were doing, then we could absolutely see that turn into something that does turn into a lawsuit.
All right, James. Well, I appreciate it, man. This was very informative, and thank you for taking the time to kind of break all this down for us, man.
My pleasure.